Well, again, my name is Rob Wolcott, and I'm an advisor to a group called Get America Working, and Get America Working is the organization that's hosting this session. So I'd like to merely mention that that organization has a focus on the prospects for and the merits of tax shifting as a means of moderating environmental and national security effects of what might be considered excess consumption of fossil-based energy, and beneficial effects of a potential reduction in payroll tax liability in terms of reduced regressivity and potentially an expansion of employment. We have two distinguished speakers, gentlemen, Rob Shapiro and Rob Williams. We are, by the way, all three Robs. We can go with an R3 kind of thinking in Washington. We're just missing the G, I guess. And as you mentioned, we're going to go with a format of approximately 10 minutes each in comments, and then we're going to open it up to just engagement in a free flow manner. I think instead of kind of moving into any of my kind of overlays on the impacts or theory, I think it's best to move directly to the speakers, although as Sue mentioned, maybe we could move very swiftly through individuals, organizations around the table. Distinguished speakers, as I mentioned, Rob Shapiro and Rob Williams. Rob Shapiro is the founder and president of SONECON, which is a DC-based economic analysis firm serving both domestic and international clients. He's a senior fellow at Georgetown University School of Business. He's an advisor to the International Monetary Fund. He was the founder and director of the Progressive Policy Institute, and he won the gold medal in the 400 hurdles. Rob Williams, to his right, is an associate professor of economics at the Agricultural and Resource Economics Department of the University of Maryland. He is also a senior fellow and director of academic programs at Resources for the Future. He has a deep interest in carbon tax theory and impacts and the modeling thereof, and has been doing such for a number of years, and brings a great deal of near-term applied work to bear on this topic. Rob Shapiro is going to begin with 10 minutes comments, which is a broader overlay on the topic, and Rob Williams will follow with his comments. So we hope to have a vibrant exchange thereafter. My job will be, if there's any kind of hesitation anytime, I'll jump in and say, hey, let's hear it from some engineers, let's hear it from some historians. But from here, Rob, would you lead off with your thoughts?
Thank you for coming, and I want to thank Get America Working, as well as the Carnegie Institute and the Policy Studies Organization. This is a remarkable summit. I was just thinking how long I've been thinking about these issues. In 1989, Reed Hunt, who later became head of the FCC, called me and said, would you come in and talk to Senator Gore? I said, you know what? He said, well, you know, he's very interested in the environment, but he doesn't really understand anything about the economic side. So can you give him a kind of background, a little seminar in environmental economics? And the truth is, I was not an environmental economist. I was trained as a monetary economist. And so I began to study it in order to teach him. And so it tells you how old I am. The case for a tax shift to create a carbon-based tax and use all or most of the revenues to cut the payroll tax, it really comes from two sources. The first is the economic argument for carbon taxes and against payroll taxes. Carbon taxes offer two advantages economically. First, it's what economists call a Pigouvian tax. That's after the great English economist Arthur Pigou, who was the successor to the Titan Alfred Marshall, was the professor of political economy at Cambridge, and also the earliest supporter of the work of John Maynard Keynes when he was a student. Supported Keynes's work on probability theory. But Pigou is not remembered for that. He's known for introducing in welfare economics and in a systematic way the concept of externalities. That is, how certain goods involve costs or benefits for people other than those who purchase them. Pollution from fossil fuels or chemical plants are the most prominent examples of negative externalities. A positive externality would be if you lived near a symphony hall and they left their window open and you could hear the symphony. The key here, economically, is that markets work most efficiently only when all of the costs of a good or service are included in the price. That's what a carbon tax is intended to do from an economist's point of view. To capture the price of fossil fuels, the cost that its use imposes on everyone else through health costs, and now we recognize also through the costs of climate change. The economic argument then is that a carbon tax helps to perfect market prices. But the welfare argument, as Pigou argued, is that by requiring those who consume fossil fuels to bear those external costs, we discourage the negative externality that creates the cost for everyone else. Similarly, the argument against high payroll taxes is that they raise the cost of creating and maintaining jobs, so we get less of them. The truth is, for many decades, that argument really had little force in the United States as a practical matter. The effects were so modest that the economy still created about as many jobs as there were people willing and able to fill them. In that context, the payroll tax offered significant advantages as a way of raising funds, mainly that the base is so large, payrolls, that you could raise a lot of money with a relatively low rate, and the lower the rate of a tax, the less economic distortion it produces. Unfortunately, the period in which, given our payroll taxes, the United States was a job-creating machine may be over. In the 2002-2007 expansion, we created only half as many jobs relative to how fast the economy grew as we did in the expansions of the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Economists are uncertain about why this is happening, and I personally suspect that globalization is the main force at work here. In global markets, jobs are being created, but not as many here. And in addition, globalization intensifies competition, which in turn makes it harder for businesses to pass along their cost increases in higher prices. That's why inflation has been so low. But if you can't pass along all of your cost increases, you have to find other costs to cut. And the costs they've been cutting, I believe, are jobs and wages. That's my current view. But whatever the reason, the slow rate of job creation we've seen, not just recently, but over the last decade, presents a new and fundamental economic and social policy problem. So policies which encourage greater job creation are at a premium. And the most direct way to do that, apart from creating public sector jobs, which is the most direct way, I guess, is to reduce the cost to businesses of creating those jobs. And the most direct way to do that is to reduce the tax on payrolls. So economically, this looks like a win-win. Reduce the tax on what we want more of and raise the tax on what we want less of. And in the process, both changes should make the economy more efficient and therefore more productive. But there's another compelling reason for a tax shift, and that comes out of political science rather than economics. Nobody likes to pay taxes, but people are generally willing to do so when they can see the benefits. We know our national defense is strong, our children get government loans to go to college, a whole family can visit beautiful national parks. We see our taxes at work. It's much harder to get people to pay taxes today for a benefit in the future. That's the model of Social Security and Medicare. But the truth is, we have no example at all of Americans being willing to pay taxes today to avoid a larger cost in the future, as opposed to for a future benefit, at least apart from paying for wars that threaten the homeland. That's the political conundrum presented by calls for a carbon tax to reduce the risks of climate change. And it's particularly acute in this case because the costs of climate change are both distant and impossible to know or state with precision. We can say, well, we think there are going to be these effects, but we can't say exactly what the impact is going to be on New York or Baltimore. And we can't say when that impact is going to occur, or on the Farm Belt, for example, or in Florida, all areas that are thought to be at significant risk. But risk, again, is a probability. It's a future event. So how do you get people to accept higher prices for heating and cooling, gasoline, and everything else they buy, since everything requires energy to produce it, to avoid higher ocean levels and more droughts or floods somewhere 30 to 50 years from now? That's the political challenge. The only answer to this problem of getting people to bear a short-term cost to avoid a larger long-term cost is to reduce the short-term cost. And that's precisely what a tax shift does. It reduces or, in principle, eliminates the short-term cost. After all, the purpose of a carbon tax is not to make people poorer by taxing more of their money, but to change the relative prices of different kinds of energy based on their effect on the climate. That is, raising the price of carbon-intensive fuels, but not the price of clean fuels, and raising the price of goods and services produced with carbon-intensive energy, and not the price of those produced with clean energy. So the political argument for the payroll tax, carbon tax shift is that it makes a carbon tax possible. And let's not kid ourselves. If we price carbon at the level required to shift people's preferences towards cleaner fuels to a sufficient degree to address climate change, that is, to put us on a path that will stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at sustainable levels, we are talking about a very large tax. This is not marginal. It's more, now that's more than a pure Pigouvian tax. Because we have to take account of all the greenhouse gases already concentrated in the atmosphere. And the Pigouvian tax just looks at the externalities today. Probably we're talking about one that would cost an average family as much as $2,000 a year in higher prices for energy and the goods and services that use it. That will never happen if the only argument is that it will reduce the risk of something bad happening 10, 20, 30, 40 years from now. I've been in politics a long time. I was Bill Clinton's principal economic advisor in the '92 campaign, and we had a BTU tax. And we had, in fact, an immediate use for it. It was going to reduce the deficit. It was the first Clinton proposal that fell by the wayside. And they never came back. It was a very traumatic experience for that administration. Neither the president nor the vice president ever went back to energy taxes again. We raised energy taxes under Reagan with relatively little difficulty. Yeah, just about that. So to make a carbon tax possible, you have to make most people financially whole. And since a carbon tax has a very large base, we need to use another tax with a comparably large base to offset it, and the payroll tax is the only candidate we have. There are briefly other economic benefits from this kind of tax shift. I'm not going to talk about the additional environmental benefits. Rob too will do that. But with respect to jobs, by reducing the costs, you know, when you reduce the cost of something, you create new opportunities for businesses to respond to this change in what we call factor prices. By reducing the cost of both creating new jobs, by cutting the payroll tax, and keeping those, and reducing the cost of keeping those already on the job at work, we would also be expected to spur innovation in business organization. That's what happens whenever there's a significant change in factor prices. With the cost of labor reduced, businesses should naturally turn to how to make those lower costs work best for them. And so just as we would expect a carbon tax to spur innovation in fuel technology and energy and other technologies, we would expect a lower payroll tax to spur innovation in the use of labor. And what I want to last emphasize is what a social necessity this has become apart from the threat of climate change. In the first 6 months of first 6 years of the Clinton administration, we created about 16 million jobs. In the 6 years of the Bush expansion, even before the 4 million job losses of 2008, we created 6 million jobs. It's a 10 million job difference from a larger base. In addition, wages and salaries have stopped increasing with productivity gains. In the expansions of the 80s and 90s, if you look at the wages of people as they age through those expansions and take account of every age cohort, on average people gained about 2.8% per year in the Reagan expansion and 3.6% per year in the Clinton expansion. It was 2.6% a year in the Carter expansion. That stopped in this last expansion, when for the first time in the post-war era, wages and salaries stagnated. Across wage cohorts, they grew by an average of 0.5% a year. Restoring strong job creation and income growth is the central economic challenge facing the second term of the Obama administration. And a lower payroll tax is a very good place to start. It's not enough, but it's a good first step.
Thanks so much, Rob. Rob? By the way, what I didn't say about Rob is he was also Undersecretary of Commerce for Economic Affairs during the Clinton administration, so following his BTU excitement, he went to that role.